Okay, picture this. A single corporation so powerful it has its own army, collects taxes, and rules over millions of people. Now imagine that same company is on the verge of complete bankruptcy, it's drowning in corruption, and it's responsible for a famine that killed millions. That was the East India Company in the 1770s. Today we're digging into the Regulating Act of 1773, the British government's very first, and kinda clumsy, attempt to tame this corporate beast and the first real step towards building an empire.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the absolute chaos that made Parliament step in. Then, we'll get into the Act itself, what it was supposed to do, and how it tried to rewire the power structure in India. We'll also cover its huge, almost disastrous flaws. And then finally, we'll see why this messy piece of legislation still matters for the constitutional framework of India today.
Right, so to really get why this act even exists, you have to understand the situation with the East India Company in the early 1770s. It wasn't just bad, it was a full-blown crisis, spiraling completely out of control.
And here's the central puzzle, the thing that just doesn't make sense at first glance. How on earth could a company that controlled huge chunks of India, had its own military, and a monopoly on some of the richest trade in the world, be going broke? It was like a giant with feet of clay, and those cracks were getting bigger by the day.
So just how bad was it? Well, the company had to go, hat in hand, and literally beg the British Parliament for a £1 million loan. To give you some perspective, that's billions in today's money. This wasn't just a tough year. This was a 5-alarm fire that showed just how rotten things had gotten on the inside. You see, this was a perfect storm of greed and total mismanagement. In Bengal, you had this system called the dual government, which basically let the company collect all the tax revenue without having any of the responsibility of actually governing the place. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Company officials, these guys who got the nickname Nabobs because of their insane wealth, were just lining their own pockets while the administration fell apart. All of this came to a head in the horrific Bengal Famine of 1770, where the company's greed and neglect directly caused the deaths of millions.
And here's the crucial part. This bailout was not free money. The price for that £1 million loan was control. This was a massive shift in policy. For decades, the government had a hands-off or laissez-faire attitude. They just let the company do its thing. But not anymore. This was the beginning of direct, hands-on government regulation.
So, Parliament's answer to this whole mess, and the non-negotiable condition for that giant loan, was this landmark law, the Regulating Act of 1773.
And this is why this act is such a big deal, a real constitutional game-changer. For the very first time, the British government stepped in and asserted direct control. It was them officially saying, okay, this company isn't just a trading firm anymore, it's a political power, an administrative body. This act laid the very first stone for a centralized British government in India. So what did it actually do? Let's get into the nitty-gritty and break down the specific parts of the act that were designed to wrestle control back from the company and its corrupt officials.
The act's first big move was to centralize power. It took the Governor of Bengal and gave him a promotion, creating the new, much more powerful role of Governor-General of Bengal. The whole idea was to have one person at the top. And the man they put in that hot seat was the experienced and, let's say, pretty controversial figure, Lord Warren Hastings.
And here's the new chain of command they set up. The Governor-General wasn't a king. He had an executive council of 4 members to work with him. Now here's a key detail that's going to cause a lot of problems later. Decisions were made by majority vote. To make this whole centralization thing stick, the other big company territories, Bombay and Madras, were now made subordinate to Bengal. No more going rogue.
So the two new top dogs in this system were Warren Hastings running the government and Sir Elijah Impey, who was made the first Chief Justice of the new Supreme Court. And get this, they were actually old-school friends. But their powerful new jobs in this very badly designed system would put them on a collision course. It was a recipe for conflict right from the start.
And it wasn't just about changing the government. The act also created a brand new Supreme Court in Calcutta. It had a Chief Justice, 3 other judges, and it was supposed to bring proper British law and order to all the British subjects living in the area, handling everything from contracts to crimes.
And to get at the root cause of the whole crisis, that insane corruption of the Nabobs, the act laid down the law. It put a strict, outright ban on the 2 main ways they got rich, doing their own private trading on the side and accepting presents, which was really just a nice word for bribes. The party, it seemed, was officially over.
But, and this is a huge but, for all its good intentions, the act was deeply, deeply flawed. Instead of creating order and efficiency, it often led to complete gridlock and some really disastrous conflicts.
So where did it all go wrong? Well, the main problem was a massive design flaw. The act created these two new centers of power, the Governor-General's Council and the Supreme Court. But it never clearly said who was in charge of what. Their powers overlapped, which basically guaranteed they'd be fighting each other from day one.
And that ambiguity led to the single biggest question of the time. Who was actually running the show here? Was it the Government Council, in charge of taxes and administration, or was it the Supreme Court, in charge of the law? The act simply didn't have an answer.
Okay, so there were three huge defects that basically crippled this act. 1. Governor-General Hastings had no veto. So his own council, the guys who were supposed to help him, could just outvote him and stop him in his tracks. 2. Nobody knew what the Supreme Court's jurisdiction really was, creating constant fights. And 3, and this was maybe the worst part, the court started applying English law to a population that had no idea what it was, which led to some truly tragic results, like the infamous trial and execution of Nanda Kumar.
But here's the crazy part. Even though the act was a bit of a disaster in practice, its long-term impact was massive. It was a messy, flawed, but absolutely essential first step on the path to a full-blown British Empire in India. Think of the 1773 Act as version 1.0. It wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of a learning process for Parliament. They quickly tried to patch up the glaring flaws with an amending act in 1781 to fix the court system. But the real upgrade came with Pitt's India Act in 1784. That was the major overhaul that finally created a system of British control that actually worked.
So why are we even talking about a law that's nearly 250 years old? Because it planted the seeds for things we still see today. The office of the Governor-General, that's a direct ancestor of the modern president or a state governor. The creation of that Supreme Court, that was the very beginning of a formal, codified court system in India. It officially kicked off the whole era we call company rule in India's constitutional history.
All right, let's do a super quick-fire recap for revision. The year, 1773. The British Prime Minister, Lord North. The key idea, shifting from decentralization to centralization. The big new job, Governor-General of Bengal, first held by Warren Hastings. The new institution, the Supreme Court at Calcutta. And the whole point? To regulate the East India Company and stop the corruption.
We've covered a ton of ground here, and if you really want to lock this in for your exams, you should definitely head over to our website. We've put together some really detailed notes and a great mind map to help you revise the Regulating Act and all the other key topics. The link, as always, is in the description below.